Hello everyone, this is Serious Trivia. Welcome back to another episode of our Humankind Emblematic District tier list video, as we're covering the Industrial Era today. If you missed out on any of the previous era, you can simply use the playlist link in the description below to check out our tier list for the previous eras. And as with those tier lists, we're going to be starting this one off by taking an overview of each of the individual emblematic district to look at their strengths and weaknesses before coming back here to rank them. So kicking things off, we have the Caravanserai from the Persians. So the Caravanserai is actually a pretty unique emblematic district because it is not a garrison building, but it can be placed anywhere, which is a huge advantage in terms of how many tiles you can exploit. And not only that, it counts as both a maker's and a market quarter, giving you exploitations for both industry and money. Now, the money exploitation is going to be rather limited, as you're only going to be able to pick up tiles such as luxuries or perhaps a few harbors to get additional yield from tile exploitation. But the industry is very nice, and the bonuses on this emblematic district includes +1 money per number of trade routes, and as we've mentioned many times before, the number of trade routes in the game can be very high if the map is big enough, as there can be a lot of different resources, whether luxury or strategic, that you can trade with other factions. You also get a default amount of 5 money plus 5 industry on the emblematic district itself, and +3 money per adjacent market quarter, and it will give you 1 trader and -10 stability. And in addition to these bonuses, your armies, if they should move through this district, will gain Swift for the next turn, which is 2 points of additional movement, which is quite a nice bonus on top. Then moving on to the Germans, we have the Coking Works, and this is an industry maker's quarter that exploits industry. You have +1 industry per population. Now, after the last round of balancing, it's very rare to see population bonuses on emblematic district, so any district that still has this bonus is very strong. And you also have +3 industry per adjacent maker's quarter. There is a penalty of +10 pollution and -10 stability, but you also get 1 worker. So overall, quite a strong maker's quarter with that population boost for industries, because you end up getting multiple copies in your city, whether big or small. You basically get your territory times your population worth of industry immediately for building the Coking's work throughout your territories. And if you go late game and combine cities and you're able to afford a large amount of food, you can get some insane production numbers from the Coking's work. Then moving on to the British, we have the Colonial Office. Now this is probably the strangest emblematic district in the game. It can only be built on your vassal's land, and it provides money per adjacent district that you cannot build because they are in your vassal's land, and you will get 2 money back for your liege, which is you. And it's just incredibly strange. +10 money on the tile, +10 money for the liege. So essentially, you are going to give equal amount of production of money here to both your vassal and yourself based on this building. And there is no job provided because it's not on your land anyways. The exploitation of money doesn't really matter. And this entirely depends on your ability of creating vassals, which requires insanely high war score, imbalances at end of war to get them to become your vassals. It is possible, but it is just very difficult and very situational. And you pretty much have to come into the industrial era with a couple vassals already so that you can take advantage of this building. And that is just a big ask, in my opinion, making this extremely situational and often useless emblematic district. Then next we have the French with the Expedition Hall, which exploits science. Now, even though this is a research quarter, it doesn't have any of the research quarter attributes. It produces influence per adjacent district. It provides a default amount of influence on the territory that it's built. There is -10 stability, no job, and the only science bonus is +1 science per population. But this is only activated when you have the Collective Mind activated. And Collective Mind is the science culture affinity ability where you turn your excess production and money into science in your city for the next 5 turns at the minimum. And this change is rather difficult for this building because now, if you move on to the contemporary era and you're no longer a science affinity culture, you essentially will get 0 science from your Expedition Hall. And that is simply a tall ask. And you might notice here, this building doesn't count as a research quarter. So all the bonuses you get from your infrastructure, all the adjacency potential you will get disappears. And essentially, it can become a building that produces zero science for you and only a bit of influence. And that is just very hard to swallow. Now, if you're picking the French to rush for late game tech because you have the forward era ability bonus with your affinity, since you are a science affinity as the French, then perhaps you can turn on Collective Mind and take advantage of this +1 science per population, which, as we mentioned before, any sort of population bonus is very strong. So there's potential there to be useful. But after this latest change, the limitations on you in terms of which cultures you can pick in the final era makes things rather difficult. You have to transcend with the French or pick the Swedes or the Japanese in the contemporary to be able to have this as a potential science boost, or else all your exposition halls becomes quite useless for you. Then moving on with slightly strange emblematic quarters with the Siamese with the floating market. This is not a harbor, but it has to be built on coastal water or lake. And because it's not a harbor, you can't just place it on any water tile. You have to have adjacent quarter already there to build this into the water. And that is very difficult sometimes if you don't have a harbor area planned out with some regular market quarters or make it quarters that reaches out to a lake or coastal water tile. And because it's not a harbor district, it doesn't exploit the two range of water tile yields. And really, it only exploits money, even though it functions like a maker's quarter and market quarter for bonuses, which is very, very strange. This is the only district in the game that doesn't exploit both the resources that's included for its quarter type. And the reason why it's pretty straightforward, because there is no industry in the water that it is placed in. So it's kind of weird for it to exploit industry. The tiles in the water doesn't exploit the tiles on the land. So I think it's fine. It doesn't punish it. And having the maker's quarter as an attribute gives you adjacency to unique harbor districts such as the Kothon, which is the only one I can think of that's also a maker's quarter, to get adjacencies and allow you to build a few maker's quarter on land to get other adjacencies as well, even though the adjacency to market quarter +3 money is one of the attributes on this harbor building or semi-harbor building. So essentially, you still want to surround this with other harbor, unique harbor, because all the unique harbors count as market quarters, but the regular harbor doesn't count as market quarter. So that's one thing there. It gives 1 money per population, and that's huge. +5 industry on top, -10 stability, no jobs provided. So it's still a bit weird and slightly all over the place. Very unique emblematic district here for the Siamese. Then moving on to the Mexicans, we have the Hacienda, and this is a very powerful farmer's quarter replacement that exploits food. It gives default 1 food, 3 food per adjacent farmer quarter, but most importantly, it gives 1 food on tiles producing food. Now, this type of bonus is often seen for legacy traits. Very rarely is it included on emblematic district. And essentially how you should think about this bonus is any tiles you have exploited or with a district that originally produced food will now produce more food. So depending on whether you have a big enough city, both in terms of number of territories and the total number of tiles being exploited, you could end up with a lot of food. And this is potentially really great even on large coastal maps, because water tiles always have food and you can gain a ton of food with haciendas without building them anywhere near the water. Because think about it, if you have, say, 5 territories, which is a pretty reasonable amount at this point in the game in the industrial era, you can get +5 food on all your tiles in the city that produce food. That is a huge instant boost of food for your faction. Oftentimes, I would say that could potentially double the amount of food output you can have in any given city. It doesn't affect the adjacency bonuses or exploitation bonuses, but essentially it lets you produce way more food with your existing land. Of course, you can continue to build out more farmers' quarters, to exploit more land to produce food, and each of them will bring back more value because you have haciendas. It also provides +1 farmer slot and -10 stability. Then moving on to the Austro-Hungarians, we have the Opernhaus or the Opera House. This is a stability building that exploits nothing. It gives 5 influence by default, +2 stability per adjacent district, and most importantly, +1 stability per district. This is actually insane. If you're ever interested in going for a challenge where every single tile in the game is going to be filled with a district, this is the way to go. Because if you think about it this way, the moment you have a 10 territory city and each territory have an Opernhaus, then every single district you build will pay for itself in terms of stability at the minimum. Because in game, -10 stability is the most you'll get from any district, with the exception of the arms factory, which doesn't produce more instability, but they do produce a new resource that creates more instability, but we can disregard that. But essentially, with the Opernhaus, every district can pay for itself. It's quite powerful, plus the additional stability per adjacent district. You can even ignore that. That's not really going to push anything forward. The default +1 stability per district is really what makes this building amazing. But aside from this building does nothing else. There is no exploitation, there is no jobs, there is no real production coming out of this building. Then moving on to the Russians, we have the Sobor, and this is a religious building. It also exploits nothing. It provides a default amount of 3 influence, 5 faith per adjacent district, and most importantly, +10 health regeneration on units, and +5 stability. So this is the ideal placement in between a bunch of garrisons on the frontier. You get the heal bonus for your units that needs to fight. You get 5 faith for each of the adjacent garrison. It doesn't care what district you're next to. You disrupt no production, you ruin no exploitation, you still get your faith, you still get your influence. Now, I have always questioned in this series whether you need that much faith. And my answer is still, you really don't need that much faith. Sure, there is a very interesting combo with the Ankler Watt where you can gain food per faith. And if you have a mega city with the Ankler Watt, you can just pump it faith to gain a huge amount of food. But even in that case, the Sobor is probably not the building to pump out massive amount of faith, because the maximum amount of faith you can gain on one of these buildings, assuming you have a full surround of district, is 30. And that's simply not enough. It is still a very nice building because you do get stability bonuses on that, but overall, it's more of a situational build. And moving on to the Italians, we have the Teatro, which is the theater. It also exploits nothing. This is an influence-focused emblematic district that provides 1 default influence, and it also boosts the influence per trader by 1 and influence per researcher by 1, which is kind of interesting. So essentially, almost half of your job is going to give you additional influence, especially researchers. You can gain a lot of them through infrastructure rather than building research quarters. So there's usually a good amount of researcher job in every city. In addition to that, you get 2 influence per common quarter. Now, commons quarter is not one that I typically build in my games. I do realize if you have the right combination of civics, you could potentially create some very nice commons quarter bonuses. But in general, I feel like using that district in particular to boost stability is really not the way to go in the game. You end up giving up a lot of exploitation because that building produces no resources, also has no exploitations for nearby tiles, just kind of ruins your production in my opinion. You gain 5 points extra stability here with the Teatro itself. It's an interesting combination of providing influence and stability for your cities, but not one that I think is particularly needed. Then finally, we have the Zulu with the warriors in Izindlu. And this is a garrison building. It exploits nothing. It's a rather straightforward garrison building. It provides the most combat strength advantage of any garrison buildings in the game at 4 points. It gives any new units created in the city or outpost 10 points of extra experience. Of course, this can stack because it's on the city or outpost. So for each one of these unique garrisons you build, you get 10 experience. The first 25 is going to give you your first veterancy star, and the next 50 and so forth. So essentially you could pump out units that's all 3-star ready, and that gives you 3 additional combat strength advantage moving forward. It gives the exact same amount as a regular garrison in terms of stability. So essentially this is just a garrison building with additional experience bonus that is stackable and additional combat strength bonus that is actually quite high compared to all the emblematic garrison buildings that's available in the game, but it doesn't provide any additional exploitations. So now that we have seen all the emblematic districts, let's jump back to the tier list and rank all of them. Alrighty, so jumping back here, we're going to start from the bottom like we always do. And in last place, it's got to be the Colonial office. This is just such a weird emblematic district. It only works on vassals' land, so oftentimes you could end up not being able to build this at all. And even if you are able to build this, you're only getting 10 money plus 2 more per adjacent from that. So you're not gaining anything else. And you can't control how many adjacencies your vassal is going to place on this district. So in the end, you could end up with, say, 12 gold per district that you're going to end up building on the foreign factions land. And what happens when they're not your vassals anymore? So the 10 is not paid back to the liege because you're no longer their liege. It's just a wasted building in my opinion, and it probably needs a redesign to make it even a viable choice for the game. Now moving on to the C tier, we have the French with their exposition hall, which used to be one of the best science emblematic districts in the game with the population boost. But since they changed it to only an active boost when you have collective mind open, it doesn't provide any jobs. That was a weakness from before as well. It doesn't have any default science. It doesn't count as a research quarter for any of the adjacency bonuses or infrastructure bonuses you can have. So now it could end up being an emblematic district once you move on to the contemporary era that produces 0 science for you, which defeats the purpose of why you wanted this building and why you wanted the French as your culture in the first place. So it's going to drop all the way down to a C tier here. Then joining it is going to be the floating market. Now this is another pretty awkwardly designed emblematic district. It's not entirely useless. The upward potential of this is quite high in terms of money production, but my opinion is money is probably one of the least useful FIMs. I believe industry is probably 1, food and science are pretty close, money is definitely the 4th place one. So in this case, I don't think the +1 money per population is going to save it, especially if you consider the fact that you can't build this as freely as you want. You must have adjacent district already placed next to a water tile to have this placed down. And then all the bonuses it has is based on adjacent market quarter, quite a limiting situation. You don't get any of the water tile exploitations. It doesn't count as a harbor, doesn't provide any jobs. So overall, I think it's rather weak. It's going to go down in the C tier as well. Then in the B tier, we have a few interesting emblematic district with the Opernhaus joining it first. Now this is quite a powerful stability boost, the most powerful stability boost in the game in my opinion because of the +1 stability on all district, and it's stackable per territory, per copies of this emblematic building. So essentially you can have cities that are just always stability positive, which is always a useful thing if you want to expand your city with many, many districts. Then joining it, we have the Teatro. This is the Italian influence boosting emblematic district. Now, usually for these districts that don't produce any useful FIMs, but rather stability and influence, we typically rank them quite low. But this one and the Opernhaus are a little bit different. The Opernhaus already mentioned the potential for a maximum district build is quite strong. For the Teatro here, you gain influence based on the jobs you have in your city. It's sort of a population boost, and influence is one of those additional resources, stability, influence, faith, that I think is actually quite useful, especially in the late game, when the cost of civics, when the cost of absorbing cities are all very high, and even claiming wonders is quite high. So if you're making any of those late game pushes, you're going to need the additional influence, and this is a perfect building for it because you can get a ton of influence just from the job positions. That means you can focus your cities on building research quarters or the proper science-related infrastructure while still maintaining a decent amount of influence boost, since each one's stackable in terms of how many influence each of your researchers can produce. On top of that, the building itself provides positive 5-point stability, so there is really no downside to this district here. Then joining them, we're going to have the Russian Sobor, and this is a faith building. And I have always looked down on faith building, And if this building just provided faith, I would still put it very low. But fortunately, it provides plus 10 points of healing. And since the adjacency for the faith is on any district and it provides positive 5 points of stability, this is the perfect frontier emblematic district to be placed next to your garrisons for the additional stability boost. For the defensive bonus, it also produced passive amount of influence and a decent amount of faith on top of it for your final tenant push. So I think it can fit here in the B tier. It's still fairly useful. You can place it around the border next to your garrisons without really worrying about it. It's not really going to hurt you. All the bonuses are rather positive. Then finally joining this group, we're going to also put the Zulu warriors Izindlu in here. And this is just a simple garrison building with some additional bonuses. The veterancy increase from the extra experience is decent. It's not going to make a huge difference. Even if you come out with 3 stars, it's just 3 additional combat strength. It's not game changing. The extra little bit of bonus you get on the district itself and the surrounding tiles for the plus 4 combat strength is also not that game changing. Although if you take all that into consideration plus the buffed MP stats in the recent patch, sure, the MPs can become insanely good defensive gods because they're getting pretty much 7 points of additional combat strength, and if they're fighting a stronger unit, even at that point, they get 8 additional points with their passive. That's just insane. 15 points of additional combat strength on MPs against enemies who are slightly stronger than them, or you're just stronger than the enemy. And either case, you're going to be winning those battles. Then jumping ahead into the A tier, we're going to put the Caravanserai in here. This has the potential for a lot of great placements because you can place this anywhere else. There's a slight military usefulness here with applying Swift for your units. It exploits 2 resources, industry and money, which means you can place it nicely around luxuries and, most importantly, mountains to secure those hard to get industry production that otherwise would be lost if you place anything other than a maker's quarter around it. And it's an easy way to secure it since you can place this building anywhere you want. The crazy bonus on this is the trade route. So if you're playing more of a peaceful faction, this will work very, very well in terms of money production. And even if you can't really get that part of the building to work, let's say you're war a lot, there's not a lot of resources to trade, the duality of this district of being money and maker, getting you a little bit of that more useful industry production is going to put this ahead of most of the other districts on this list. Then finally, our 2 final districts are both going to be A tier. We'll start with the Hacienda, and this is the Mexican farmer's quarter that produces 1 food on all tiles ready producing food. That's its main point, and that point alone makes it one of the best food producing emblematic districts in the game. Because if you are focusing on food growth, this can make all your existing food growth tile so much better. Imagine combining cities in the late game where you end up with, say, 10 plus territories, then every single tile you have food is going to generate suddenly 10 extra food. That includes all the harbor tiles you can pick up. And in my opinion, that's roughly doubling your food production in some cases, assuming you don't have any other crazy synergetic strategies going on like the Ankler Watt. You're going to be able to support quite a bit of population just with the Hacienda. Finally, with the Koking's work, this is one of the few districts left in the game that can still produce per population industry. The last building that worked like this, the Barai, has been nerfed, and this is probably the only one. The slight drawback here is it does have a little bit of pollution, but at this point, 10 points of pollution is nothing. And by the time you get into contemporary, you can either balance out this with a bit of tree planting before you get the green tech, or just embrace the pollution and try to finish the game before it becomes a real problem for you in terms of losing yield on your land. So that's going to do it for our tier list here. Please let me know in the comment if you agree or disagree, if you have any cool ways to use any of these districts in particular. I'd love to hear it. The Ankler Watt strategy with the crazy Gothic cathedral producing thousands and thousands of food from our last tier list really gave me great ideas, and I'm glad you guys can explore these strategies. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this tier list. We'll come back later this week with the final tier list of the contemporary emblematic districts. So until then, bye.